Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 2, Part 3, I think is where we're at. Just like the other videos in Chapter 2, they talk about mission, vision, value statements, and I argue that before you're ever going to get there, you need to understand some other things. So that's what we're diving in. Just as a reminder, if you've taken Management 360 with me, organization and management, or org management, you probably already went through this. So if you're watching it on YouTube, you can probably turn up the speed or whatever if you want to get through it a little quicker. Other than that, I think it's a good review. So we will keep going. Whoa, let's just do screen. There we go. Okay. So we went through, we talked about the Ansoff matrix that helps us to understand risk in its part in the strategy process. Then we went through what business strategy is versus financial strategy and how you align the two. They usually go in opposite. We also remember that the strategy is your business strategy and your financial strategy are from the perspective of the agent or the CEO, the manager, the board of directors, the internal, or what we would often think is internal. So, uh, for business risk that is high, financial risk should be very low, or for very high, it should be very low. Um, this again is internal. So the CEO, the corporate executives would look at the world and say, well, what is the lowest risk source of funding we can get? And the answer is venture capitalists. Venture capitalists are expecting to lose their money. Um, so if this doesn't work out, great. That those investors and those types of people understand that that's just the way it goes. And then as the business risk decreases, then the level of financial risk can increase in opposite proportions. Being's the lowest level of or highest level of financial risk is usually borrowing money via debt, where you have to make periodic payments and they have to be paid off, both principal and interest by X date. From the standpoint of the business, of the company, going and borrowing from the bank or bondholders is the highest level of risk. Um, Now, as we talked about before, oh boy, I can't stand that thing. There we go. As we talked about before, there's this inverse relationship when we talk about the financial metrics that we're monitoring or the idea of the finance of the company. A potential investor is not the same thing as an investor. One is a potential principal, the one is the principal. And the principal wants an undervalued asset to become overvalued. The CEO of a company that's hired by the principals they're the hired gun to run the organization. They too want to make sure an investment goes from undervalued to become overvalued. So we have this earnings relative to principal, and it's the relationship between these two things. We analyze this usually through discounting cash flows, and we have discount rates and net present value and all of that, and we calculate those things. Okay, so when we're discussing this stuff, almost, I think for everything in this class, we'll be looking at it from the standpoint of the agent. Even when we maybe a little later on, we'll do some stock valuations so you can understand it. We'll try to understand the difference between a current investor, owner, principal, and a potential investor, owner, principal, so you can see the relationship between the two. Now, business risk is what leads the strategy, not financial strategy. Financial strategy, business risk or business strategy is formulated, and then financial strategy comes into play and gets aligned. Okay. And the purpose of the business strategy is to create a sustainable competitive advantage. That's the goal. So then we get into a bunch of other tools that are used to kind of run the company or I don't know, formulate a strategy or a plan. So Boston Consulting Group was one of the big consulting firms. They came out with their BCG matrix. They categorize each product line. You have the question marks, the cash cows, the stars, and the dogs. And the idea is you ditch your dogs unless there's a reason not to. So another very well-known consulting firm is McKinsey and Company. And they, of course, if Boston Consulting Group comes out with something, McKinsey has to come out with something. So they have their three horizons of growth. When my wife worked for 3M, they were a product leadership company. That was their goal, is to come up with innovative products that become solutions wherein others couldn't find solutions to said problems. When they did that, I think this was 10 or 15 years ago, they were following kind of a McKinsey three horizons of growth. So when we talk strategy, we're almost always talking about growing the company in some way, shape, or form. So what McKinsey and Company said is we're going to have three horizons. The first horizon, about 70% of the time, we want the employees and everyone to focus on producing and selling our main product. Okay, whatever, and usually that's the cash cow or the star, where we want you focused on that. So if we think of the product life cycle, we want that's like the growth and maturity area. So spend 70% of your time on that. Then we want you to spend 20% of your time on nurturing emerging businesses. So I'm going to fly back and forth here. Apologies. If you look at the life cycle, okay, that's when these new launch products, the 2.0 versions, or even brand new product lines, we want about 20% of the time spent trying to foster those emergent markets, those emergent products into fruition, because those are the ones that are going to become the mainstay products here and not too long. And then lastly, 10% of the time under McKinsey's three growth horizons, we talk about creating completely new business. So my wife in her job, she used to spend or was required in her performance evaluation to tell the company the 10% of her time she was going to spend trying to come up with brand new innovative product launches or product lines. Either updating, renewing, innovating, whatever the product line she was working on. It was, what's the future going to look like? What's the next thing this is going to turn into? So in McKinsey's three horizons of growth, you have horizon one, 70% of the time is spent on your core product line or your core business. 20% needs to be spent on emerging business, and then 10% is spent on trying to create completely new business that wasn't already looked at. So some of these aren't necessarily strategies. Well, yeah, I guess they could be strategies as much as they're trying to give a schematic to run the company or run the business. So that's McKinsey's three horizons. We've talked about value disciplines. This is the one that I rely on 9 out of 10 times because I think it's easy, it's quick. And this is where I've seen fault happen, where you have very well-intended managers that start veering off in a different value discipline unintentionally because they just didn't know that or think that their company is formulated uh, with a purpose. Okay. So we want to make sure our growth in whatever value discipline continues to head in that value discipline. So again, if Walmart is an operationally excellent firm, they don't want to start looking at how they can become product leaders and have the best products, or they don't want customer intimacy or customer service because they're not built to do that. In order to do that, it would take billions and billions of dollars of resources they don't have. Then we get into Porter's Five Forces. Now, for Porter's Five Forces, I am going to send out, actually, I'm going to write a note. We're going to send out uh, some links for you to watch. Porter's Five Forces is probably the dominant strategic tool that is taught in business schools. Harvard and Harvard Business Review is usually the seen as all companies kind of look at that one is the original source to innovative new ideas and theories. So Porter's Five Forces looks at, well, it creates a couple of different parts. One of them is as competitive forces are growing up, profitability is going down. There's an inverse relationship. If profitability is uh, excuse me, if profitability, yeah, is, let me say this correctly. If competitive forces are going up, it's shrinking profit margins because you have new competitors. Now, that works great for customers, does not work great if you're the producer or the firm or the company or the business. You want to pursue arenas where there isn't a lot of competition. Um, the airline industry is often looked at in Porter's Five Forces as asking the question, why in your right mind would you ever get into the airline business? Because margins are so tight, and especially with once the airline industry in the United States became deregulated and you had these new low cost entrants coming in, those companies figured out because they don't have to pay their pilots as well or their flight attendants as well. They were able to drop ticket prices, and then you had Southwest who hedged on fuel. They were able to drop ticket prices so low that the mainline carriers, United and American, couldn't compete with them really. The startups were, or the low cost carriers were just beating the tar out of them. So what that means is if you were to start a new airline, there's not a lot of option and profit margin there to go after. It's most of them are, it's the margins are very, very small in comparison to other industries where profit margins are big. So in other words, what does that mean? It means there's a lot of competition and good luck trying to compete and win in that industry. So Porter's came up with a few different things. He has what is called Porter's generic strategies, and then we have Porter's five forces. And this is kind of the diagram of what that theory looks like. Again, the idea is the company doesn't only just compete with direct competitors. They also are influenced and have forces acting upon them from buyers, from suppliers, from substitute products, and from threats of new entrants on top of existing competitors. So there's always something going on. And those forces that are acting upon the company, in my mind anyway, I look at it and say most companies they can't just do whatever they want to do because of these forces acting on them. They're often forced to go in a certain direction, and that gets into something called game theory. We're not going to touch on it too much in here. If you took managerial economics, you address game theory there, which is when you're looking at your competitors, if you do option A, then the only logical option for the competitor is to do whatever corresponds to A. And then if you go to B, then you have the option that's looked at from the competition. So you, in game theory, there is always a winner and always a loser. It's zero sum. Now, wonderful people in the business world, such as Warren Buffett, have said actually business does not have to be zero sum. There are ways to not operate in that capacity. I think it does help a little bit to understand the world in terms of zero sum, but I also agree with Buffett that in a perfect world, we're not just trying to compete with each other to kill each other because that doesn't work out for anyone. But we do operate in a competitive system where that's kind of the point. You look out and you do what's best for your own best interest. Uh, Internationally, we can see this far more now, where we have a threat of competition from China. As of 2025, very often manufacturing facilities in the United States will guard their trade secrets with their lives and often will not allow in certain types of employees, especially international employees. So a lot of times you have international students that will come to school in the United States, and 3M, General Electric, many of the other US manufacturers will not allow certain international folks to come in and work in their places because they're trying to protect their trade secrets. So you have other countries that are sending people in and then they come and work for that company for 3 years and then they fly on back to their host nation, or excuse me, their nation of citizenship, and then they're sharing those secrets. And China just happens to be one of those that has been very good at that. So they've stolen a lot of the copyright and trade secrets, and they don't operate over there under the same legal system we do, so they can do that in China. And China's only one country of many that sort of play that game. So in this handout, I give you all of the different things to look at in Porter's five forces. So for example, when we look at threat of new entrants, some of the things we want to take into consideration is economies of scale. Can new entrants, are they able to scale up or is it too costly? How about if they try to create brand identity and loyalty? Do we have a strong enough brand that will, you're, the new entrant's not going to be able to gain a foothold? So all of this is to look in consideration, what are those five forces likely going to act upon the company? Then, based on all of those, what actions should we take or could we take to maximize our position? So I'm going to leave it at that. And again, I will try to put out some videos for you to watch uh, in regards to that, a much more detailed explanation, or not much more, a little more detailed explanation of Porter's five forces. Then we get into something called a pestle analysis, and these can all be done at different levels. The pestle analysis is often used in conjunction with Porter's five forces and what's called a SWOT analysis. By now, every one of you should have completed a SWOT analysis for a company, for yourself, for the university. If you've taken any number of classes, up to and including management, marketing, and many others, you've probably done a SWOT analysis, which is the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So a pestle analysis looks at external factors, sort of, if you imagine Porter's five forces, these are kind of more direct competitors. If you imagine another ring even higher or farther out there, that's what a pestle analysis is. So it looks at and examines these factors so you're aware as a company or leading a company, what do we need to keep our eyes on here? What is going to have influence on our company? So PESTEL stands for political, PESTEL, political factors, economic factors, social factors, technological factors, environmental factors, and legal factors. All of those are external pressures and forces that can be played upon the organization. So when we do our strategic planning, we want to be aware of what's going on there. That's another reason, many of these, that's why you need to read the Wall Street Journal or some business periodical. There, I don't even know of one. Maybe Morningstar publishes something, but other than the Wall Street Journal that has a daily news site that is filtered through an editor to help you understand what's going on in the world. So pestle is just another analysis you want to make sure you're aware of. I try to give you a list of everything that you would want to take into consideration in those factors. So there's a list in the political, there's a list in the economic, the social, the technological, environmental, legal, so on and so forth. Okay, the next one, we've kind of already talked about this one, those Boston Consulting Group growth matrix. So we take that, we classify our products. It's a kind of there's a little bit of similarity to the McKinsey and Company three horizons of growth by looking at what are we doing, what's working, and what's not working. And we take into account the growth rate of the market or expansion of selling said product into the market relative to how much market share do we currently have, or I should say expected market growth rate. So based on those, we categorize our products or services into four categories. We have our stars that are expected to have high, much more market growth. Okay, we're not saturation's a ways off yet, but we already have a fair amount of market share. You have your question marks that have low market share, but they have a high potential market growth rate. You have cash cows that have a low growth rate, but high market share. So think of Gillette in the, well, imagine Gillette 15 years ago in the razor market. There wasn't any other player in there. I'm sure there was a generic competitor of some sort out there, but for the most part, Gillette was the main company. Well, think about that for a minute. If Gillette has almost the entire market at that time for straight razors, uh, just as a little side fact, one of the reasons men don't typically like using the electric razors is because your skin kind of has to get used to them, and they can kind of break out and rash or razor burn, and it's kind of rough on the skin, where a straight razor is much more clean cut and uh, less razor irritation. So Gillette 10 or 15 years ago had all of the market, but they probably weren't growing a lot. Okay, so they had a lot of market share. Um, so their razors were cash cows. They were making a lot of money. Now, if we go back to Porter's Five Forces, we know when profit margins are pretty high, and at that time, Gillette had, I mean, and they are doing it today. They're charging an arm and a leg for their razor, and actually not the razor, not the stick, but the cartridge. They charge an arm and a leg for the cartridges because they're pretty good. They're high end. So the profit margins were wide enough where others said, wait a minute here. We don't need to pay for a $5 for a cartridge that only lasts 1 week. There's got to be a better way to do this. At least sell them for cheaper. So then you had Harry's Razors and Dollar Shave Club and those things that came into fruition because the profit margins were wide enough that, well, why not? Let's sell this on an operationally excellent uh, value discipline and see if we can't go after some of those profit margins. And they've been successful to some point. Okay, so that gets us into the Boston Consulting Group matrix. Again, you want to ditch the dogs unless there's a good reason to keep them, and there are once in a while. So one of the things that can be done in an organization is if you have a product line that still could be, let me use General Electric or 3M. If they have a division or they have a department or a product line that's a dog, but it could be successful, but they don't have the wherewithal or the patience to turn that into something. Instead of just letting that product line dissipate into existence, they might sell it off and sell all of the machinery used to make it and divest it. So when they sell it, they're probably going to sell it at a little bit of a loss, but they're still going to get more than if they just threw the equipment away or didn't stop using it, if they sell it for something. So that's called a divestment. And this gets us into core competencies. And that's where the Ansoff matrix, all of this starts coming into reality. So, a core competency is something that the company wants to identify, is something they do well. Okay. In fact, they do it better than others do it. Now, you can have a core competency that it doesn't pass the VRIO analysis, so it's not a sustainable competitive advantage. A core competency is, well, there's a number of different types of core competencies. I'm trying to think how to even, here are a couple examples. Consistent, high quality, incomparable value, ceaseless innovation, clever, successful marketing, great customer service, formidable size and buying power. Um, I had a, well, this is kind of interesting. Wonder how much I can talk about this. Yeah, give me a second. I'll be right back. So, what do you guys think? Like the new look? No? Yes. No? Okay. Sorry. Got to have a little fun with it once in a while. All right. So, when we talk about core competency, this to me was kind of an interesting one. When I was going to school, I had a professor that it was so bizarre. He was had his PhDs, full professor at the university. And 10 years prior, he was teaching in an MBA program and a couple engineers that were in the program. Really like talking with him, working with him, and in class, and told the the company that they both worked for about this guy and bringing him in and doing some consulting work. They did a little bit of consulting work, and then subsequently they end up hiring him on, and then he becomes in a short order, becomes the general manager or president of the company, and not very long after that. So he was also still a full professor and would teach MBA classes. When he would do this, he would tell this story about core competency and companies trying to figure out kind of what that is. So when he worked for this manufacturing company, he talked about the invention of this thing, and I'll hold it up to the camera here. Okay, so what this is a tag for like on vegetables or products, and it's kind of a rubber band thing. So you put this around a bundle of fruit or asparagus or whatever, and then it's a tag that's on there. Now, when you look at that, most of us think, well, that's who cares? Um, but this professor, when he started working with this company, he was trying to determine what are their core competencies. They've been very successful. I can't give you much more information, but they uh, produce things like labels and packaging material and things like that. And the professor was trying to figure out what their core competency was, and he learned that the thing that they could do that no one else could do had to do with their rolling machines and the ability to apply an adhesive in a certain way where you're putting multiple different components like a rubber band or piece of rubber on a sticky or gluing it and adhering it to laminated paper, something like that. And apparently, no other company out there had ever been able to do that. So that's a trade secret. They want to protect that. It's a core competency. So when he was going through this process of figuring out what are they good at, what are they better at than anybody else is, he figured out that it was this ability to put these two materials together, glue them together in a roller where they could make 10,000 of them an hour or 10,000 in 10 minutes or whatever it is. So nobody else could do that, which is what made all those types of things so expensive relative to the price that they could produce it at, had to do with the technology they had created with these rollers. So as he learned this, they went to a bunch of different trade shows. It had to do with, again, produce and bread bags and all sorts of stuff like that. Uh, they started doing marketing research, and the owner, the founder of this company, would go with them to these events. And he said the best market research is get your feet on the ground and go out there and start looking at what the customer sees. Good marketing is not done internally inside a building where you're manufacturing whatever it is you're doing. It's on the outside. That's where you learn all the information. And I think that's pretty good advice. It's get out there and see what's going on. So they came up with this idea to put these two things together. I apologize. I have an exterminator out spraying for wasps on my property. Um, they put out, or they created this thing to put on vegetables. And I thought it was so interesting because he's telling that story. And then they were trying to sell it to all these large producers. And Walmart uh, came up with, for certain produce, they required that type of tag because otherwise they would have to put a sticker on bananas or whatever, and the sticker would almost it never stayed on. So this was a solution to a problem. So a number of large retailers like Walmart decided for certain produce they were going to require these types of stickers, or these types of bands that had the price on it and barcode and QR code and all that. So that was this company's core competency. That's what they were good at. Now, fast forward 10, 12 years later, other companies have been able to figure out how to produce that and do the same thing. Um, but that was their idea. So it was something that they could do and it had to be explored. And it was, what do we do better and that nobody else can do? And remember when we talked about the Ansoff matrix, that you had the diversified strategy. That going in the diversified box might make sense if somehow you're relating it to some core competency that you have. And that's where, let's go ahead and share this again. That's where on the Ansoff matrix, we had a 6-step box. Sorry, I'm sure that was pleasant to hear in your ear. I'm going. Here we go. So we had this 9-box matrix where you had partial diversification. So if you have a core competency that's associated with a diversified thing, then you're kind of okay. The problem is when you have a completely diversified, so you know nothing about anything and you don't have any core competency that relates to whatever it is you're doing. That's a fully diversified, and that's a pathway you don't want to go down unless, well, there, I want to be careful. I don't want to tell you don't do a diversified strategy, but there might be an opportunity where you find a niche, a special thing that nobody else can do, and you have a strong belief that it could be very, very lucrative. I would argue if you think you found that, then 8 out of 10 people in a room should you should be able to convince them pretty easy of this. If on the other hand you talk to 10 or 12 other executives and they're like, you're on mushrooms, that'll never work. Well, then it's, probably a bad idea. But I'm not saying there isn't something out there. So we have this core competency. It's like, what are we good at, and how does that feed into whatever we're producing or serving or our value discipline? Okay, our core competency. Now, there is a relationship between core competency and the sustainable competitive advantage. They're separate theories in part. One I'm sure came up with at one university, Princeton or something, and the other was a Harvard idea. Uh, they're similarly related. I also plugged in a few other personal core competencies. Remember again, none of this is open source information. I didn't write most of this. However, I did add portions to it. So, well, a lot of this you can find online. All right, so that gets us to our SWOT analysis. Now, a SWOT analysis is one that I have, oh boy, the number of times I was in a strategic planning meeting where we did it. The first thing we usually would be a SWOT analysis. So in a SWOT analysis, you're trying to kind of think of those core competencies or attributes of the company and figure out what are your strengths? What are you good at? Usually those are going to be your core competencies. What are you better at than others? And then you create a list or a bullet point list of all those things. Then you go to what are your weaknesses? Now, your strengths and your weaknesses are internal in origin. Okay, they're within the firm. So you write down all your strengths, you write down all your weaknesses, and try to be exhaustive. Then you go down and you do the opportunities and threats. So opportunities and threats are external in origin. So you write down what are some opportunities out here? Uh, what are some threats that could be opportunities? So you list all of those out. Once you've done that, what you've in effect done is you've created a competitive framework for trying to see the world. Okay. You're taking into account those threats that are external in origin. So competitors, those suppliers, the buyers, all of those things. Um, you're taking into account everything in a competitive frame of reference or framework to understand how do you move forward. Man, I talk with my hands a lot. Next one we're going to get into. I'm putting these in here because they are well, they're actually way bigger than tools. If you've ever seen a road being constructed, or interstate or something, they have these huge machines that actually lay the concrete and shake it, and that's how they do large swaths of or large patches of road at the same time. Well, you can imagine in this machine that creates this stuff, there's all of the mechanical components to this. It's insane. There's so much going on there. Um, I bring that up because some of these other things are like tools. They're like a hammer. They're like a drill. The balance scorecard is much more like the machine that lays the road or interstate. It's a full-on system. It's the main part of the system. So this was created by Robert Kaplan and David Norton, and it breaks out the world in terms of four components. And those four components are related to what you need to be successful. One of them is the financials. Okay. If you're not turning a profit, you might need to consider what are you doing wrong and how do you turn a profit, okay? Because the rest of it is not going to work if that's not happening. So what they do is they break down these four components into further components, and uh, the logical framework for you to think about the world in terms of this. So General Electric, for example, might adopt the management system called the balance scorecard. Our textbook often uses the balance scorecard. I think in one of the other sections of this, they actually have you go through an entire company and do a company analysis using a balance scorecard. So the four parts to that are financials, customer relations, okay, internal processes. The study of management always assumes that you're trying to make things more efficient and more effective. Always remember that. That's the intent of management is to become more efficient and more effective at whatever it is you're doing. So in the balanced scorecard, we look at internal processes. How do we make things more efficient or more effective? And then learning and growing, which is kind of a continuous improvement, which is not to be confused with TQM, total quality management, which is the next system we're going to talk about somewhere in here. Um, you have these four parts in the balance scorecard, and the last is learning and growth. So that's in there to how can we continue to improve upon these other three, and how do we invest in our employees to get them to feel like they're a part of this and trying to improve upon this each and every day. So this is a system. General Electric or 3M or the Mayo Clinic would adopt the balanced scorecard system. And the intent is to, in all of their management functions, to include like their performance reviews and their HR department and their accounting department. They look at all of these four components and they put that on top of every one of their business lines. So in their corporate board meetings, they would probably have a balanced scorecard report that would go through and hit like five different financial ratios or metrics that they're trying to improve upon. They would try to analyze patient retention or patient experience. So there would be probably survey results in that component. For the internal processes, they might talk about discharge time or time in the hospital and trying to shrink that for patients. And then learning and growth are, well, if you're a clinic or you're a healthcare organization, you probably need to be learning and growing because it changes pretty quickly. So that's an entire system. That's called the balanced scorecard. That's not a one-stop tool. It's a big system tool, I guess, or system framework. This is just another picture of the balance scorecard, um, and how they relate, interact with each other. Another one. And it just discusses that. So I would encourage you to read through those. Then we get to the TQM, which is called Total Quality Management. Edward Deming, who was think he was a PhD that sir worked a lot in Japan, was an efficiency and management expert, and he created this idea of TQM or total quality management, which is trying to forever improve upon what it is you're doing. Similar to the balanced scorecard, they break it out into 8 different functions to watch, monitor, and analyze. One is employee involvement. Another is process centered. Another is systems thinking. How do we make things more efficient, more effective? Strategic and systems approach. How do we harness that core competency so we're headed in the direction we want to be heading? Continual improvement, fact-based decision making. That was a big one with Edward Deming. Um, very big is he was one of the first that talked about uh, evidence-based decision making, which is sort of a subsector of management research or studies. Um, Give me one second here. So, two professors at Stanford University, Pfeiffer, Sutton are their names, tout evidence-based decision making in the management field. They promote this in opposition to another type of sort of system, which was that management is an art. The level of complexity with everything we're doing is so complex. To try to make everything evidence based would be almost impossible. So for many years, we had, uh, oh, what's his name? Peter Drucker. He was much more management as an art, and he promoted it as such at multiple universities. He's probably one of the most cited management scholars out there. Again, his was management is an art. You can have person A do everything a certain way, and the outcome will still be different if you have person B that did the exact same things. Why? Because the level of complexity is so much that it's impossible to recreate those outcomes. Therefore, management is an art. Pfeiffer and Sutton and Edward Deming look at the world more in terms of fact-based decision and making. Taken to an extreme, this is often called a technocrat, where everything's driven by numbers. If you watched, Brad Pitt was in it, Moneyball. That was sort of one of the first touting, if you will, of the evidence-based decision making and how when you compare system A the way it is, and then you put in evidence-based decision making. In Moneyball, they took what people thought were just average performers, but actually had very high metrics uh, to them in the Major League Baseball, and they plugged him in. The gentleman and then Brad Pitt's character ended up saving millions of dollars, and they won games by pairing these things together as opposed to listening to scouts and conventional baseball managers talking about how everything is, well, Tom's a good guy and he'll do real well next year, and I think he's ready to bloom, and yet the numbers don't suggest that whatsoever. So those are the two pendulums swinging constantly in the study of management. Deming is much more of the evidence-based, fact-based decision making. Then you have communication, trying to create transparency. Um, we may talk about that later. Transparency, in my mind, is just an absolute must in management. When a company or managers try to hide stuff, I've just never seen it end well. And mostly because you have, this is going to tick a lot of people off, but when you have management that is trying to shield things or hide things from employees or customers and things like that, you'll often find you have an emotionally immature CEO or person that's deciding that. It's not someone that is able to be highly emotionally intelligent and mature, figuring out a way to communicate with everybody in the good times and the bad times about almost anything. Okay. And there might be reasons for that. Maybe the ethics of said manager aren't very good. And then customer focus. How do we make sure we're taking care of the customer in that regard in the manner in which we want to? So that's TQM. Remember Edward Deming. Then you get to Six Sigma and Lean Six Sigma. Six Sigma is a statistical analysis system that was created, I believe, by folks at Motorola. And what it is it's trying to get rid of the error rate per or defect rate in production down to one defect. And I think it's something like 6 million. So if you imagine a bell curve, let's just go there. Oh, I hate it when this does this. There we go. Okay. So you have a bell curve, and here you have the first sigma or the standard deviation. And then you have the second standard deviation. So when you're analyzing something that's normally distributed, about 68% of whatever's being, well, I shouldn't say forecasted, whatever's being analyzed falls within this, the mean or the mode, uh, or the statistical mean. Then it goes out to the second standard deviation, which adds another 12.5 to 13%. And then you get out to the third and last, well, what we normally think of as the last sigma, which is about 3%. So what Six Sigma does is it pushes it out to the four, imagine the five, and then the six, which is like having one error per 6 million units produced. That's the goal. That's what you're trying to get to. Now, in manufacturing, I don't have any good examples that can discuss that. There we go. Um, to discuss that, but to give you an example of like what Six Sigma could be analyzed is if you look at airline crashes. Um, I utterly hate flying, and yet it drives me nuts because statistically, I know I'm the chance of me dying in a plane crash is like 1 in 12 million. So it's actually double the Six Sigma. It's less than even that. So airline flight has a crash rate or defect rate of less than that Six Sigma. That's pretty good. If you look though at car accidents, the chance of dying in a car accident, I believe, is 1 in 12,000. Now, 1 in 12 million versus 1 in 12,000 is kind of a big, there's a big difference there. It's way stronger chances you would die on in a car crash. But yeah, logically, you can't push that hard into my head. I just don't buy it. So Six Sigma is a statistical system, too many S's here, is a statistical system that is used by companies to reduce those error and defect rates to a very, very small level. Now, here's where things get interesting. Over the years, when I've talked to students about this, I've asked, why would a company want to focus on this? What does it matter? Why would it matter if Motorola were trying to get rid of the defects per rate or whatever for their phones manufactured? Who cares? Like, okay, there's going to be out of 1 million produced, 1,000 of them are going to be, defective phones and are not going to function or something in uh, I don't know, something didn't get soldered right. Or, I mean, that's just life, right? Well, there's a reason why they're doing that. They're doing it to get rid of risk, to remove risk. Risk is analyzed statistically, and it's events per however many events that happened. So when you get rid of these error rates, you reduce the risk and you make things more predictable. Okay, which is that's what reducing risk is. You make things more predictable. So now you can better forecast them. When you can better forecast them and your forecasts become way more accurate. So at the company, if you imagine at the high top of the echelon, you've reduced risk. So now your regression analysis is way more accurate because you've gotten rid of the fluctuation. You've taken it from this to, like this. Well, if everything becomes more predictable and it now everybody kind of knows what they're getting. So before, when we talked about the valuations of like General Electric, when you reduce or get rid of and remove the risk, what in effect you're doing is you're decreasing the amount of earnings needed per the price you're willing to pay. Okay, it's the relationship between these two things. Let me give you an example. If you took Management 360 with me, we go through and spend the first week or two doing stock valuation analysis. The reason I do it is actually to better understand the rationale and reason behind the Six Sigma and why things operate the way they do in 2025. And this is a huge component. So when we try to figure out for a company what the rate of return should be, we do it based on risk. To analyze risk in the stock markets, so I really do not like how that. Hmm, let's go to Yahoo Finance. I love that it can read. Figure out what I mean. Okay, so we looked at General Electric earlier. Again, it's June of 2025. For those of you that care, come on. No, there we go. Okay. So here's a basic schematic of the stock of General Electric. If you wanted to buy a share of it today, it would cost you $250 per share. For that $250 per share, you're earning $6.35. Now, how that's determined is based on risk. The lower the risk, the earnings don't, they stay the same. Okay. And in fact, hopefully they become way more accurate because you've reduced the production error rates because you're using Six Sigma. So now everything's more predictable. So now your earnings reports are way more accurate. You reduced risk. So what that means is the stock price should go up relative to the earnings, okay, which shrinks the discount rate or required rate of return. Now, in business, for the most part, we teach all business students that we use something called the capital asset pricing model to determine what General Electric, based on any level of risk, should earn in the stock market. So, in order to calculate this, we utilize data from my Watson and Associates to figure out for a company that's the size of General Electric, what's the average rate of return you should receive. Then we ask the question, what is the absolute risk-free investment? What does that earn? And that's usually a 91-day treasury bill or a 10-year treasury note. Right now, we'll just say that you can earn about 4.32%. The last factor in figuring out what the rate of return should be on General Electric stock is something called the beta coefficient. Beta coefficient is the risk. And don't ask me the formula. It's something like the covariance of the stock divided by the variance of the market or whatever. It's analyzed where a beta coefficient of less than one means it's less risk than the market. A beta coefficient of more than one means it's more risk than the market. And a beta coefficient that's negative means that when the market goes up, this one goes down. And the closer to one it is, the closer to perfect it is. So if you think of anything in a correlation coefficient, it's kind of analyzed similarly, although you can have a correlation or a beta coefficient that goes up higher, much higher than one. Okay, so based on the fluctuation of the stock price and the earnings, When we look at General Electric, they have a beta coefficient of 1.39. A beta coefficient of more than one means it's more risky than the market overall. Okay. A beta coefficient of one means it's the same risk. A beta coefficient of less than one means it's less risk. So a beta coefficient of 1.39, we plug that in 1.39, hit calculate, and we get a beta coefficient or a discount rate or a rate of return based on a level of risk for General Electric. We should earn a rate of return of about 12.77%. That's how much we should return. Now let's go ahead and move forward because I'm going to show you then how we plug this into a DCF analysis, discounting cash flows. So here we put in the earnings. The earnings were $6.35. Those are expected to grow at a rate, so we need to analyze what their growth rate would be. I shouldn't be doing this because this is just making this video really long. Uh, Yahoo Finance used to have this information. They don't anymore. Seeking Alpha has it. So we go in here, type in GE. Stay with me. We go to, I want to say growth. That's where you find the growth rate. So there's different ways you can analyze this, and there's different ways you can run this calculation. There's 22, I believe, on here, 24 different ways you can analyze this formula. So we're going to say, to make life nice and easy on us, GE is expected to grow for the next 5 years at a rate of 7.47%. So we're going to enter in the 7.47% and level off to all companies we learned in the product life cycle or the organizational life cycle go in decline. But we know if a company is shrinking or it's not able to grow at least 3%, we set that to inflation. If they can't grow that a year, then they usually fire the CEO and they bring in a new team. So the minimum that's kind of required is that 3%. So all companies level off to growth of 3%. We got that 12.77 from the previous calculation. And that tells us on a risk adjusted basis that General Electric stock should be about $80.17. But when we look at it, it's $250. So we think it's worth 80, but you can buy it for 250. So if you saw a house listed for $80,000, but it was going for $250,000, would you want to buy it? And the answer, well, no, it's totally overvalued. But what if the real estate agent could sell the house for the 250? Well, how awesome would that be if you're the owner of that house? It'd be awesome. And be awesome for the real estate agent because their commission is even bigger. Okay, the buyer, though, of the said house would not be awesome because that means that this is overvalued when we compare it to average and we compare it to a level of risk. So when you hear the terminology of risk and return, that's what they're talking about is actual quantitative risk. Okay, so let's get back to our Word document. So we were talking about Six Sigma. Six Sigma is trying to reduce the error or defect rate per 6 million or something like that. It's to get it to a very low level. Why would you want to do that? Because you make things more predictable. Why would you want to make things more predictable? Because it reduces risk. When it reduces risk, it causes the stock price to go up relative to the earnings. It takes something that would be undervalued or lower valued and making it higher valued. So that's why Six Sigma is utilized in so many manufacturing facilities and many companies anymore. I do believe Mayo Clinic or other service industries have adopted Six Sigma to work towards that again because of the predictive value of it. So the other thing that has happened lately is we have this thing called Six Sigma, and it's been paired with lean manufacturing or lean engineering. Lean engineering is it's trying to reduce the waste in the production process. 4 or 5 years ago, I had a student. Sorry, I had a student that was working for a construction outfit in eastern South Dakota, and they would do work in usually in about 100 to 150 mile radius around Brookings. And we were talking about if I had asked him, have you heard of lean manufacturing? And he started laughing because he was in construction management. And he said, yes. And I'm a true believer in it. So I kiddingly, I asked him, I said, how much time do you think your crew or the crew of guys you work with, how much time do you think is wasted traveling to get a tool that's at another location? And he just, or maybe he told me that, whatever it was, he said, Bruce, in a 50-hour work week, he said 10 hours are wasted trying to either get equipment or get tools or get the right person over there. So we're talking, what would that be? Almost 20% of their time is wasted on because they have to go do these other things. So they become horribly inefficient. So lean manufacturing processes went in to sort of say, okay, let's stop doing that. So one of the things, if you work in a lean environment, that they'll do is if they have tools, those tools will be on like a wall or a board, and they'll have the outline of said tool. So if you need a tool, you grab it, you go fix whatever you're doing, and you bring it back and you put it in the exact same spot where the outline says it should be. And by doing this, you're reducing that wasted time, energy, and effort to a much lower level. So it's cost savings all over the place. So many companies have adopted this lean manufacturing processes. And now, in fact, you can go to school and you can get certified as a lean engineer. So you have Six Sigma and you have lean manufacturing, and it was just a logical pairing. They put it together called Lean Six Sigma. Also, the Six Sigma thing is they have it like belts in karate, where if engineers come into 3M, they have to first get their like tan belt or green belt, and then they can go to school for a month or two and become a black belt. And that's when apparently they really can do the cost saving stuff. In fact, they have to, in order to get through the program, to get the belt, they have to have a cost savings project of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, that type of thing. Okay, we're finally here. Now, the Six Sigma total quality management balanced scorecard, I don't know that that's needed to create a mission, vision, or value statements, but a lot of the rest of these tools are needed for that. You need to know your core competencies. You need to know if you possess a sustainable competitive advantage. You need to know your value discipline. You need to have a five forces analysis and a pestle analysis, SWOT analysis, all of this stuff. Because when you possess that information and you're getting ready to try to come up with a mission statement and a vision statement, vision is where do you want to go? Mission is what's our job to do today? When you're trying to come up with that, you need to see the full landscape. You need to see it at a high view, a 10,000 or 20 or 30,000 foot view, so you can see the entire map, okay? Or see everything down below. And then you can strategize and figure out, based on that, what should our mission be? What is a niche in there? What is a way to compete without having to go head to head with a behemoth competitor? And you need that information. So I put a few of these together just as a document or as a diagram, excuse me, to help explain how in my mind, I look at all of this information. So here we have, why does the customer buy this product or service? It usually has to do with one of these. They're buying it based on price. They're buying it based on having the best product or something to do with the product. They're doing it because they want the best customer service, or there's a balance between the operational excellence and the product, which means the best overall solution. We put that under the heading of customer service or intimacy. And then we have locational rationale. Starbucks is thought to be so competitive because of their locational excellence. Okay, so why the customer buys that then feeds into the value discipline. Okay, when you as a company are trying to compete with all of these other things, the why the customer buys it kind of feeds into, well, what's your value discipline? And again, you don't want to change value disciplines. Now, your value disciplines, real quick, the reason operational excellence isn't low cost producer is because it's kind of the thing that's done in order to compete. So it, Walmart, the question is, how does Walmart produce everyday low prices? And it's two things. They have a supply chain that is world renowned. And although Amazon is starting to kick its butt, but they have that in their bargaining position. When Walmart buys light bulbs from General Electric, they're not buying 10,000, they're buying 10 million because they're buying so many. And General Electric can either have the business or not have the business. General Electric's going to say, okay, we want the business. We want to produce as much as humanly possible. So Walmart has a bargaining position. If you compare it to like Lewis Drug, their Lewis, the store, they buy, you know, 20,000 or something to Walmart's 10 million. So that's how Walmart's able to achieve their low price. So then that gets into how your core competency feeds in to those value disciplines. It's the detail of how you're doing it. And then lastly, that feeds into your sustainable competitive advantage. Which goes back to the VRIO analysis. Okay. Do we have something that has value, usually to the customer? Do we have something that is rare? Do we have something that is almost impossible to imitate? And do we have something where the whole organization is built around this core competency that produces what nobody else can seem to be able to do? If you answer yes to all those, then you have a sustainable competitive advantage, and that's when you guard it with your life. Once you know that, then you can make a mission statement that actually means something, and hopefully a vision statement because of your pestle analysis, your five forces analysis, all of that information tells you, gives you the map, and it says, hey, you know what? Nobody is going over here. Maybe let's go over here because that'll be the path of least resistance. Okay, but you wouldn't think of that if all you're doing is, oh no, what should we do? I don't know, let's do this. It doesn't work like that. And companies aren't going to spend, millions of dollars. Strategic planning can be very costly because you have the executives doing things that they don't affect the bottom line other than cost. So this just gets into mission statements, vision statements, and developing that. You have different levels of this. Usually a mission statement goes into the vision statement. Where do you want to go? And then the value statements. What values do we want to emphasize? What do we want to do? What do we not want to do? Which feeds into the strategic plan, which feeds into a tactical plan, which feeds into an operational plan. Strategic plans usually are 1 to 5 years out. Tactical plans are usually about 6 months to 2 years, and operational plans are usually a 1 year time horizon. And there's something you get into called management by objective, which is cascading goals. In other words, if you imagine a triangle hierarchy at the top, you have the strategic plan. A little lower down in the divisions, you have the tactical plan. And then towards the bottom with the kind of grunt employees and the frontline managers, that's when you have an operating plan that feeds into the tactical, which feeds into the strategic plan. Management by objective. Okay. In your handout, I give you various questions from resources that try to help you to formulate a mission statement. Things to consider: who are your customers? What are your major products or services? What geographical area do you compete? So on and so forth. Vision statement: is it appropriate for the organization and for the times? Does it set standards of excellence and reflect high ideals? Does it clarify purpose and direction? And then value statements. Does the value statement express the company's distinctiveness, its view of the world? Is it intended to guide all the organization's actions, so on and so forth? So all of those feed into that. Now, we're going to have to stop here because I got to get a drink of water. And then the last piece before we get into chapter 2 on mission statements and vision, well, strategic planning, I want to talk about mergers and acquisitions, because this is another thing when we talk about growing, buying competitors, or looking at the full map and seeing our suppliers, our buyers, our direct competitors also can start helping implement our strategy without having to reinvent things. You can just go buy your competitor. So we need to know, we need to have at least a bare minimum of knowledge to know, like, what do we look for um, when we're trying to do a merger or acquisition. So we'll stop there. I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll try to get this next video out as soon as humanly possible.